Is Christian theology the same thing as wisdom? Let's consider. Hello philosophers, I'm Chico. Welcome to the Philosopher Channel summary of the Summa Theologica. In this video we'll consider part 1, question 1, article 6, whether sacred doctrine is the same as wisdom. Aquinas' position is that it is the same thing as wisdom, and he quotes Deuteronomy 4:6. This is your wisdom, talking about scripture, and understanding in the sight of nations. So therefore, it is the same thing as wisdom. His argument goes like this. Number 1, wise people arrange and judge. So like, for example, the leader in an office who is supposed to be wise. I know they're not always, but that's what's supposed to happen, right? So the leader in the office first judges, looks at things, and through his or her wisdom determines the way that things should be, and then arranges, acts on that judgment. 2, lesser matters should be judged in the light of some higher principle. And in support of this premise, he gives 2 examples. The first, in the order of building. Consider an architect versus the laborers. The architect is considered the wise one as opposed to the laborers, because the architect has the form of the entire thing, the entire building in mind. The laborers, on the other hand, deal with trimming the wood, making ready the stones, and those little details. But it's the architect that is the one who's got the whole big picture, right? Who's got the higher principle. And in support of this, he quotes 1 Corinthians 3:10, as a wise architect, I have laid the foundation. In other words, the architect is considered wise. The second example he gives is in the order of all human life and just in the way we live. The prudent man is called wise. And in support of this, Proverbs 10:23, wisdom is prudence to a man. And why is the prudent man called wise? Because he acts to a fitting end. What it means by that is that the prudent person is constantly making all their actions with a proper goal in mind. So they're not wasting any of their actions, right? All their actions are headed toward the right goal. And that's why we call them wise. And they have this higher principle that they're using. So the wisest person in any one order considers the highest principle in that order. And so he who considers absolutely the highest cause of the entire universe is the wisest of all, right? If you are wise by considering the highest principle in your order, you're wise in your order. Well, if you're considering the highest cause of all the universe, right, then you're wisest of all. But God considers the highest cause of all the universe. I should explain to you a little bit about Thomas's view of how God knows all things. So, Thomas thinks that God is omniscient, knows all things, and the way that he knows all things is through knowing himself. And so God knows himself perfectly, and exactly how that is and will become evident as we go further. But Thomas believes that, everything pre-exists in the cause, right? A thing pre-exists in some way in the cause. So God, by knowing himself perfectly, knows all the things that he is going to cause, right? He knows all of his effects, what all the effects are going to be. So by knowing himself perfectly, he knows all things. So he knows, by knowing himself perfectly, he knows the highest cause of the entire universe. He knows everything about the universe and everything like that. So God is wisest of all, and not necessarily because he knows everything. I mean, of course, he does know everything, but because he knows how everything should be, right? He knows how to order everything. That's what it is to be wise. Remember, to arrange and judge, that's the wise person's deal. So wisdom, and by wisdom here meaning the greatest wisdom, wisdom is the knowledge of divine things. And by divine things, he means knowledge of God viewed as the highest cause. And here he is looking at Augustine and De Trinitate 12:14. Sacred doctrine essentially treats of God viewed as the highest cause. But sacred doctrine essentially is interested in God as the highest cause, right? That's what it's looking at by its very nature. And in 2 ways. First, as known through creatures, and that's the way that the philosophers know him. And Aquinas points out Romans 1:19 says, that which is known of God is manifest in them. In other words, you can know God from his effects, right? From the creatures that were created. And two, sacred doctrine treats God as the highest cause as he is known to himself only, but is revealed to others. So sacred doctrine is especially called wisdom. Also, sacred doctrine is wisdom above all human wisdom, right? Because it's from God. It's from as revealed by God. Also, sacred doctrine is wisdom absolutely, not merely in any one order, right? Because it's looking at God as the highest cause of the entire universe, not in your one order of, let's say, your architecture order or your human life order, right? Your prudency or your house building, but in the entire thing, right? The entire universe. That's what we're looking at. So that is wisdom just in general. Okay, the first objection to this. Number one, the wise man directs and is not directed. This is from Aristotle's Metaphysics 1. So, no doctrine which borrows its principles is worthy of the name of wisdom. If you're borrowing your principles, then you're being directed, you're not doing the directing. Sacred doctrine borrows its principles, so sacred doctrine is not wisdom. And his reply to this is that premise 1 is false in this case. Sure, sacred doctrine borrows its principles, but it derives its principles from divine revelation. And divine knowledge, which is the highest wisdom, sets all of our knowledge in order. So even though it's borrowing its principles, its source makes it such that it is going to be, in this case, wisdom. And not only wisdom for itself, but wisdom that directs all other sciences, all other knowledges. Objection 2. It is part of wisdom to prove the principles of other sciences. And this he gets from Ethics 6. Wisdom is called the chief of the sciences. Sacred doctrine, however, does not prove the principles of other sciences. So, sacred doctrine is not the same as wisdom. And his reply to this one is, once again, premise 1 is false in this case. The principles of other sciences are going to either be self-evident, so things that can't be proved but just are evident in themselves, or are going to be proved by natural reason through some other science. So if you were one of the other sciences, those would be your two options there, right? You could have one or the other. You're either self-evident principles or you're getting your principles from some other science. But sacred doctrine doesn't get its principles through some other science or from being self-evident, but from divine revelation, right? It's sort of like a third thing here. So the concern was, if it's not one of those sciences that is self-evident and therefore used to prove other principles, then it would be one of those sciences that has to have its principles proved by some other science. But Aquinas is saying, that is a false dilemma. There's actually a third option here, which is divine revelation. So Aquinas says it is not the concern of sacred doctrine to prove the principles of others, but he says actually to judge them. This is an interesting stance from Aquinas. He says that anything that you find in any of the sciences that is contrary to sacred doctrine is false. And he quotes 2 Corinthians 10, 4-5, destroying counsels in every height that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. So this little extra, this is kind of extraneous here, right? This little extra part that Aquinas puts in there, that sacred doctrine is sort of the arbiter of truth here. If there is a conflict between sciences, the sacred doctrine, gets the go-ahead. Everything else has got to be secondary. That may sound unsavory to you. Ultimately, I think, though, if you believe that this is God's truth, then you're going to have to say that that's the way things are. I wouldn't worry about it too much, though, because I think that you're not ultimately going to have a conflict. You're going to have sometimes when there are things that seem conflicting, but there's an ultimate resolution that maybe we just don't have yet. So, for example, one of the sciences, history, at one time said that there was no Pontius Pilate ever because nothing had ever been found about Pontius Pilate. And there seemed to be a conflict there. And the Bible clearly teaches that there was a Pontius Pilate. So, and in that case, we have to say there was a Pontius Pilate. And yes, indeed, eventually the archaeologists found an inscription saying, I think it was like some theater that said, there was a plaque saying that this theater was dedicated by Pontius Pilate. So we did eventually discover the evidence that Pontius Pilate existed. Was it the case that he didn't exist before we found that? No, of course not. So sometimes it's the case that other sciences are wrong. Sometimes it's the case that our interpretation of sacred doctrine is wrong. So if you were, let's say, a flat earther, and there's a passage somewhere that says something about the four corners of the earth, right? And something going to the four corners of the earth. And you hear something like that, and you might say, well, see, there must be four corners of the earth. It must be a rectangle. Well, not quite. Saying the four corners, I don't believe that there are four corners of the earth, but I use that verbiage. Why? Because it's phenomenological language. It's language that describes the way things seem to be. It seems to be like, things are such that you can go this way or that way, right? I'm talking about the different directions that you can go. So it seems like it would be flat, but it's not. And I don't actually believe that it's flat, right? And it's very similar to using the term sunrise. If I said that sunrise is at 6, you don't say, well, the sun doesn't actually rise, right? The earth rotates, so there's no such thing as sunrise. No, you know what I mean by sunrise. Yeah, it's phenomenological language. It's not meant to indicate that there actually is a sunrise. And in the same way, that passage is using a common locution to indicate in something going to all places in the world, something like that. So if you tried to use that to teach that the world was flat, then you would be misinterpreting sacred doctrine. Sacred doctrine isn't making that kind of a hard stance. So it could be the case that we're just misinterpreting sacred doctrine, but if we are correctly interpreting sacred doctrine, and there's some things that are just obvious, like, for example, the resurrection. There's no way of interpreting that any other way than Jesus resurrected physically from the dead, and that if that didn't actually happen, then we are screwed, right? That Paul specifically says that if he's not physically resurrected from the dead, we're to be pitied pitied more than anybody else, because our faith is totally in vain. So if somebody were to come up to me with some kind of reason and said, I found the body of Jesus Christ, I'd have to say, sorry, I don't believe you. And not because they're actually right and I'm just putting my fingers in my ears and saying, la, 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 I'm not listening to you, right? That's not why. People make mistakes, right? These other sciences make mistakes. And this sacred doctrine can't be mistaken. If interpreted correctly, it's from God. So there just can't be a mistake. So I don't really care what kind of evidence that you can give me. You must have made a mistake somewhere, right? And of course, I don't know how you would try to prove that, right? Like, are you going to find DNA evidence? How do you know that DNA is Jesus' DNA in the first place? Right? Did you have some kind of sample beforehand? I don't know. So that's the mentality that I think that Aquinas is talking about here. I know that not everybody's going to like that. Some of you are going to say it's anti-science. I don't know what to say about that. For me, it's like, let God be true and every other man a liar. If I really believe this, then I'm really going to believe it. But objection 3, sacred doctrine is acquired by study, but wisdom is acquired by God's inspiration. And in support of this, he gives Isaiah 11:2, wisdom is numbered among the gifts of the Holy Spirit. So sacred doctrine is not the same thing as wisdom, right? It's one of those things that is just gifted to you. It's not something you get by studying. But again, sacred doctrine is something you study. And as a reply to this, Aquinas points out that there's actually 2 ways that you can get wisdom, or 2 different kinds of wisdom maybe. So judgment appertains to wisdom. So the twofold manner of judging produces a twofold wisdom. The first way to judge is by inclination. And he describes this as whoever has the habit of a virtue judges rightly of what concerns that virtue by his very inclination towards it. What does he mean by that? He means that, like, if you are a virtuous person, then you don't sit there and reason in your head, if A, then B, if B, then C, okay, this is the right thing to do, right? You just have an inclination toward it. You just sit, you're just built in a particular way that something just is wrong and you don't do it, and something else is right, you do it, and that's by the habit of virtue that you have. And in this way, Aquinas points out, the virtuous man is the measure and rule of human acts. In other words, you look at a virtuous person to find out what is virtuous, right? You see what a virtuous person does and say, oh, that's the right thing to do. The second way to judge, however, is by knowledge. And his description here is, as a man learned in moral science might be able to judge rightly about virtuous acts, though he had not the virtue. So think ethics teachers, right? There are a sad number of ethics teachers that have been busted doing very unethical things. They know all this stuff about ethics, and they're just awful people. So knowing about ethics doesn't actually make you ethical, doesn't make you a good person. But it does give you wisdom in a sense, right? It gives you wisdom in that you have knowledge of what that wisdom would be. Just in the same way that I might know how to work out, but that doesn't make me fit, right? I do, having the knowledge gives me wisdom in that sense, and being able to know what to do, but it's not like it's not the same way as a person who is just healthy, who's always doing those things, just knows what to do because they know what feels right. So Aquinas says the first way of judging divine things is a gift of the Holy Spirit. And he quotes 1 Corinthians 2:15, the spiritual man judges all things, and Dionysius the divine names too. Hierotheus is taught not by mere learning, but by experience of divine things. And the second way, Aquinas says, of judging divine things is acquired by study, though its principles are obtained by revelation. In a way, it's like me learning just through book knowledge how to go work out, but in a different way, because it's not like me actually getting the knowledge by studying, but by actually God giving it to me through revelation. So a little bit different, but the same idea. So once again, then, the basic idea here is that sacred doctrine is wisdom because it deals with God as the highest cause of the universe. And so it is wisdom in general because it's interested in the world in the most general sense. It's kind of like this. Remember that, like, when he starts off saying that the wise person is about putting things in the right order, right? Is about making things the way that they should be. Well, how do you know the way things should be? You've got to know the intention of the Creator. The Creator made them to be a particular way. So if you know the Creator and the Creator's intention, then you know the way that they're supposed to be. And so sacred doctrine is interested in just that, right? So that's why sacred doctrine is wisdom. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video. Adios.